Hi. The sixth section of The Art of Literature is an essay titled On Thinking for Oneself. This comes from a section of Perurga, Schopenhauer's later writings, titled Selbstdenken, literally self-thinking, thinking for and through oneself. Here we will see Schopenhauer contrast the man of letters, the man of learning, about whom he's spoken so disdainfully in the previous essay, with the true thinker, the true philosopher, the man of genius. He introduces here as well the additional vocabulary of the Book-Philosopher versus the genuine philosopher. He also catalogues the harms of reading too much or reading for the wrong reasons. And towards the end, he makes a number of really striking comparisons, including one comparing the independent thinker to a monarch who possesses a certain kind of authority from within rather than from without. So watch for that. I think that's very valuable. In this first part of the essay, Schopenhauer will begin with the observation that knowledge requires organization. Here's what he writes. A library may be very large, but if it is in disorder, it is not so useful as one that is small but well arranged. In the same way, a man may have a great mass of knowledge, but if he has not worked it up by thinking it over for himself, it has much less value than a far smaller amount which he has thoroughly pondered. For it is only when a man looks at his knowledge from all sides and combines the things he knows by comparing truth with truth that he obtains a complete hold over it and gets it into his power. A man cannot turn over anything in his mind unless he knows it. He should, therefore, learn something, but it is only when he has turned it over that he can be said to know it. Reading and learning are things that anyone can do of his own free will, but not so thinking. Thinking must be kindled, like a fire by a draught. It must be sustained by some interest in the matter at hand. This interest may be of a purely objective kind or merely subjective. The latter comes into play only in things that concern us personally. Objective interest is confined to heads that think by nature, to whom thinking is as natural as breathing, and they are very rare. This is why most men of learning show so little of it. So just like a library, our thoughts require organization in order to be useful to us. It's not enough merely to pile up facts, no matter how many facts we acquire, if we don't have them well organized and cataloged and available to us. And I'll add as well, I think it's more than just a huge number of facts plus pattern recognition, which is something that an LLM can do. What's really needed here is an act of synthesis by a living intellect. This is the means by which your knowledge, your thoughts become a genuine part of you. They're sort of grafted onto your living being, to your mind. So the idea, the metaphor of data collection, of just putting more and more lines in a spreadsheet, is really the wrong way to think about knowing. It's something much more organic and more genuinely human. Schopenhauer also observes here that thinking is not a voluntary act. We can't force ourselves to think at will. And it also requires a certain kind of fuel to sustain it. And Schopenhauer observes this fuel can be objective in the relatively rare true thinker who just has a drive to know and is also attracted by the inherent interest of reality, of what he seeks to study. That's the sort of spark, the fuel that drives that sort of thinker. Or the fuel can be subjective. It can be the personal interest that the thinker takes in the outcome, seeking something useful, perhaps. And already we can see that there are two kinds, but there's also, we can sort of sense that the objective kind is going to have a certain kind of a greater nobility and completeness to it. In the next part, Schopenhauer will contrast thinking with reading, and also thinkers, as a type of person, with readers. Here's what he writes. It is incredible what a different effect is produced upon the mind by thinking for oneself, as compared with reading. It carries on and intensifies that original difference in the nature of two minds which leads the one to think and the other to read. What I mean is that reading forces alien thoughts upon the mind, thoughts which are as foreign to the drift and temper in which it may be for the moment, as the seal is to the wax on which it stamps its imprint. The mind is thus entirely under compulsion from without. It is driven to think this or that, though for the moment it may not have the slightest impulse or inclination to do so. But when a man thinks for himself, he follows the impulse of his own mind, which is determined for him at the time, either by his environment or some particular recollection. The visible world of a man's surroundings does not, as reading does, impress a single definite thought upon his mind, but merely gives the matter and occasion which lead him to think what is appropriate to his nature and present temper. So it is that much reading deprives the mind of all elasticity. It is like keeping a spring continually under pressure. The safest way of having no thoughts of one's own is to take up a book every moment one has nothing else to do. It is this practice which explains why erudition makes most men more stupid and silly than they are by nature, and prevents their writings obtaining any measure of success. They remain, in Pope's words, forever reading, never to be read. Men of learning are those who have done their reading in the pages of a book. Thinkers and men of genius are those who have gone straight to the book of nature. It is they who have enlightened the world and carried humanity further on its way. If a man's thoughts are to have truth and life in them, they must, after all, be his own fundamental thoughts, for these are the only ones that he can fully and wholly understand. So what's the problem with reading? Well, one who reads gets his thoughts from outside of his own mind. He ends up thinking alien thoughts. He is, to use a new metaphor, like a blank book that's written in by someone else. Right? I have blank pages. Somebody else writes in the blank pages of my mind. Why? Because I don't have a pen of my own. The contrast here is with what we might call more homegrown, organic thoughts, which have a certain kind of elasticity to them. Schopenhauer says that the world inspires the thinker to have thoughts of his own that are in accord with his own nature and temperament. And this reminds me very much of Nietzsche, later on, what he'll say about a certain kind of person, that there are people who receive thoughts and values from outside of themselves, and there are people who are not overwhelmed and dominated by what they receive, but are able to process it and produce something new and genuine. And I think that's the root of that idea in Nietzsche, is I think here in Schopenhauer in a certain form. We're told here as well that erudition, learning, can be a hazard to originality, that a true genius, a true thinker, reads not other people's books merely, but the book of nature, draws from experience. And we can think of examples of this from our own time, for example, bad fan fiction, or very derivative entertainment, movies that seem like they're simply copying the plot beats and structures from much better movies from the past. We're familiar with this, and I think this is part of what Schopenhauer is getting onto, that there's a certain kind of lacking in originality, derivative thinking that goes on out there. In the next part of the essay, Schopenhauer will catalog the many hazards of reading, and here they are. To read another's thoughts is like taking the leavings of a meal to which we have not been invited, or putting on the clothes which some unknown visitor has laid aside. The thought we read is related to the thought which springs up in ourselves as the fossil impress of some prehistoric plant to a plant as it buds forth in springtime. Reading is nothing more than a substitute for thought of one's own. It means putting the mind into leading strings. The multitude of books serves only to show how many false paths there are, and how widely astray a man may wander if he follows any of them. But he who is guided by his genius, he who thinks for himself, who thinks spontaneously and exactly, possesses the only compass by which he can steer aright. A man should read only when his own thoughts stagnate at their source, which will happen often enough even with the best of minds. On the other hand, to take up a book for the purpose of scaring away one's own original thoughts is a sin against the Holy Spirit. It is like running away from nature to look at a museum of dried plants or gaze at a landscape in copperplate. A man may have discovered some portion of truth or wisdom after spending a great deal of time and trouble in thinking it over for himself and adding thought to thought. And it may sometimes happen that he could have found it all ready to hand in a book and spared himself the trouble. But even so, it is 100 times more valuable if he has acquired it by thinking it out for himself. For it is only when we gain our knowledge in this way that it enters as an integral part, a living member, into the whole system of our thought, that it stands in complete and firm relation with what we know, that it is understood with all that underlies it and follows from it, that it wears the color, the precise shade, that distinguishing mark of our own way of thinking, that it comes exactly at the right time, just as we felt the necessity of it, that it stands fast and cannot be forgotten. This is the perfect application, nay, the interpretation of Goethe's advice to earn our inheritance for ourselves so that we may really possess it. Was du ererbt von deinen Vätern hast, erwirb es, es zu besitzen. He tells us that reading can serve as a substitute for original thought, and this is contrasted with the inner compass of the thinker who looks within himself, finds in his thoughts and his processing of reality a sure guide for his action. There is a term of art that's used here by Schopenhauer, by the translator, the sin versus the Holy Spirit. You should know, if you don't know that scriptural reference already, that is the one unforgivable sin. It's said in the Bible, that's the one sin that God will not forgive, is the sin versus the Holy Spirit. Schopenhauer's version of this here, the unforgivable sin of the intellectual life, is reading in order to avoid thinking one's own thoughts. If I feel myself starting to have a thought and I go seek out something to read quickly so I can sort of put that fire out before it starts, quell that. That seems to be the ultimate kind of betrayal of one's own intellectual nature. It is like, he says, preferring the copy or the artificial museum plant to the real thing that you can have in nature. It's absurd, and it's a sort of inversion of a proper valuing of reality. Even if getting knowledge from a book is faster and more efficient, thinking this through and discovering the truth for yourself is more valuable, because in that way, the truth that we know, the thought that we think, becomes an integral part of our knowledge. It becomes a living member of our mind. We can know it, he says, precisely, and we are able then to deploy it at the right time with prudence. There's a way in which it is genuinely ours when we have it for ourselves, when we discover it this way through our own thinking, versus looking it up in a book, which gives it to us, if at all, in a much, much lower register. In the next part of the essay, Schopenhauer is going to give us a number of analogies and draw out some of the implications of this contrast that he's introduced. Here's what he writes. The man who thinks for himself forms his own opinions and learns the authorities for them only later on, when they serve but to strengthen his belief in them and in himself. But the book-philosopher starts from the authorities. He reads other people's books, collects their opinions, and so forms a whole for himself, which resembles an automaton made up of anything but flesh and blood. Contrarily, he who thinks for himself creates a work like a living man as made by nature. For the work comes into being as a man does. The thinking mind is impregnated from without, and then it forms and bears its child. Truth that has been merely learned is like an artificial limb, a false tooth, a waxen nose. At best, like a nose made out of another's flesh. It adheres to us only because it is put on. But truth acquired by thinking of our own is like a natural limb. It alone really belongs to us. This is the fundamental difference between the thinker and the mere man of learning. The intellectual attainments of a man who thinks for himself resemble a fine painting, where the light and shade are correct, the tone sustained, the color perfectly harmonized. It is true to life. On the other hand, the intellectual attainments of the mere man of learning are like a large palette full of all sorts of colors, which at most are systematically arranged, but devoid of harmony, connection, and meaning. Reading is thinking with someone else's head instead of one's own. To think with one's own head is always to aim at developing a coherent whole, a system, even though it be not a strictly complete one, and nothing hinders this so much as too strong a current of others' thoughts, such as comes of continual reading. These thoughts, springing every one of them from different minds, belonging to different systems, and tinged with different colors, never of themselves flow together into an intellectual whole. They never form a unity of knowledge, or insight, or conviction, but rather fill the head with a Babylonian confusion of tongues. The mind that is overloaded with alien thought is thus deprived of all clear insight, and is well nigh disorganized. This is a state of things observable in many men of learning, and it makes them inferior in sound sense, correct judgment, and practical tact to many illiterate persons who, after obtaining a little knowledge from without, by means of experience, intercourse with others, and a small amount of reading, have always subordinated it to and embodied it with their own thought. The really scientific thinker does the same thing as these illiterate persons, but on a larger scale. Although he has need of much knowledge, and so must read a great deal, his mind is nevertheless strong enough to master it all, to assimilate and incorporate it with the system of his thoughts, and so to make it fit in with the organic unity of his insight, which, though vast, is always growing. And in the process, his own thought, like the bass in an organ, always dominates everything and is never drowned by other tones, as happens with minds which are full of mere antiquarian lore, where shreds of music, as it were, in every key, mingle confusedly, and no fundamental note is heard at all. Those who have spent their lives in reading and taken their wisdom from books are like people who have obtained precise information about a country from the descriptions of many travelers. Such people can tell a great deal about it, but after all they have no connected, clear, and profound knowledge of its real condition. But those who have spent their lives in thinking resemble the travelers themselves. They alone really know what they are talking about. They are acquainted with the actual state of affairs, and are quite at home in the subject. The thinker stands in the same relation to the ordinary book-philosopher as an eyewitness does to the historian. He speaks from direct knowledge of his own. That is why all those who think for themselves come, at bottom, to much the same conclusion. The differences they present are due to their different points of view, and when these do not affect the matter, they all speak alike. They merely express the result of their own objective perception of things. There are many passages in my works which I have given to the public only after some hesitation, because of their paradoxical nature, and afterwards I have experienced a pleasant surprise in finding the same opinion recorded in the works of great men who lived long ago. There are some great comparisons here. One of my favorites is that thinking is a natural growth of thought, of ideas within the mind, like the growth of a child gestating in the womb, versus reading, which he compares to being a kind of a robot or a zombie, an automaton. Right? There's something unnatural about it. It's like a false nose or a nose made of someone else's flesh. It's not genuinely your own. He also, a great image here of to read is to think with someone else's head, or it's like having knowledge of a foreign land only from travelers' reports rather than from firsthand experience, or the historian reconstructing a scene versus the eyewitness to the scene. There's something valuable about the person who's present and fully engaged with the reality, the experience, the object of knowledge that they are encountering. I'm especially appreciative of Schopenhauer's contrast here between men of learning, these book philosophers we'll see later on, and the relative illiterates who are able to work properly with their own limited experience and limited knowledge. I think of a man who knows relatively little, but what he knows well, and what he knows thoroughly. He's applied his mind to it, he's drawn lessons from his experience, and he's able, within that fairly small scope, to be wise and prudent. Schopenhauer says, such a person shows more sense, judgment, and prudence and tact than these men of great learning who can boast of tremendous amounts of knowledge that they possess. And the ideal then for any of us, for the true thinker, for the true philosopher, is to be like those illiterate persons, but on a large scale, which means to have a certain kind of capacity and strength of mind to master not just a narrow area, but many more areas, a larger area than the whole. So there's a suggestion here of a kind of magnificence that's required on the intellectual scale to do not what the man of learning does, which is absurd and a dead end, but to do what the wise illiterate does. Perhaps I'll put it that way. But simply expand it with greater and greater power of mind. In the next section of the essay, Schopenhauer is going to give us some insight into the value of waiting on our thoughts, waiting on our insights, rather than forcing them. And here's what he writes. The book-philosopher merely reports what one person has said and another meant, or the objections raised by a third, and so on. He compares different opinions, ponders, criticizes, and tries to get at the truth of the matter, herein on a par with the critical historian. For instance, he will set out to inquire whether Leibniz was not for some time a follower of Spinoza, and questions of a like nature. The curious student of such matters may find conspicuous examples of what I mean in Herbart's Analytical Elucidation of Morality and Natural Right, and in the same author's Letters on Freedom. Surprise may be felt that a man of the kind should put himself to so much trouble, for, on the face of it, if he would only examine the matter for himself, he would speedily attain his object by the exercise of a little thought. But there is a small difficulty in the way. It does not depend upon his own will. A man can always sit down and read, but not think. It is with thoughts as with men. They cannot always be summoned at pleasure. We must wait for them to come. Thought about a subject must appear of itself, by a happy and harmonious combination of external stimulus with mental temper and attention, and it is just that which never seems to come to these people. This truth may be illustrated by what happens in the case of matters affecting our own personal interest. When it is necessary to come to some resolution in any matter of that kind, we cannot well sit down at any given moment and think over the merits of the case and make up our mind, for if we try to do so, we often find ourselves unable at that particular moment to keep our mind fixed upon the subject. It wanders off to other things. Aversion to the matter in question is sometimes to blame for this. In such a case, we should not use force, but wait for the proper frame of mind to come of itself. It often comes unexpectedly and returns again and again, and the variety of temper in which we approach it at different moments puts the matter always in a fresh light. It is this long process which is understood by the term a ripe resolution. For the work of coming to a resolution must be distributed, and in the process much that is overlooked at one moment occurs to us at another, and the repugnance vanishes when we find, as we usually do, on a closer inspection, that things are not so bad as they seemed. This rule applies to the life of the intellect as well as to matters of practice. A man must wait for the right moment. Not even the greatest mind is capable of thinking for itself at all times. Hence, a great mind does well to spend its leisure in reading, which, as I have said, is a substitute for thought. It brings stuff to the mind by letting another person do the thinking, although that is always done in a manner not our own. Therefore, a man should not read too much, in order that his mind may not become accustomed to the substitute and thereby forget the reality, that it may not form the habit of walking in well-worn paths, nor by following an alien course of thought grow a stranger to its own. Least of all should a man quite withdraw his gaze from the real world for the mere sake of reading, as the impulse and the temper which prompt to thought of one's own come far oftener from the world of reality than from the world of books. The real life that a man sees before him is the natural subject of thought, and in its strength as the primary element of existence, it can more easily than anything else rouse and influence the thinking mind. Thoughts don't come when called, so what we can do instead of demanding that they come to us is simply to prepare ourselves to receive them. So the example that Schopenhauer works out at length here is when we're making a difficult decision, one that's quite significant for our future, we need time. We need time to stew over it, to think it over, both, might say, consciously and also subconsciously. And what any of us finds, if you think back on occasions like this in your own life, is that the decision in your mind emerges gradually, this resolution. And one day I'm simply aware that, yeah, I've made up my mind now, and I'm fully confident in it and ready to act on it. What's been happening is that my subconscious mind, we would say in our language, has been working on it sort of in the background while I've been doing other things. Over the course of many days and weeks, I've been also, with another part of my mind, considering and processing what goes into this decision that I need to make. And this is what Saunders translates here as a ripe resolution. More recent translation gives this as a ripening of decisions. No doubt this is a kind of German expression. And this, Schopenhauer says, is the proper place for reading in the life of a thinker. It's not that you never read, but that you read in order to give your brain the downtime that it requires in order to arrive at these decisions. I like very much the quote from the very end of this section where Schopenhauer says, the real life that is before him is the natural subject of thought for the thinker, and that we should never forget this. You're here to think not about the writings of other people, but about real life, about the world as you are encountering it and experiencing it. And reading can be an asset to that, but it can't take the place of it. In the next section of the essay, Schopenhauer will tell us how to recognize a book philosopher and to tell him from the real thing. Here's what he writes. After these considerations, it will not be matter for surprise that a man who thinks for himself can easily be distinguished from the book philosopher by the very way in which he talks, by his marked earnestness and originality, directness, and personal conviction that stamp all his thoughts and expressions. The book philosopher, on the other hand, lets it be seen that everything he has is second-hand, that his ideas are like the number and trash of an old furniture shop, collected together from all quarters. Mentally, he is dull and pointless, a copy of a copy. His literary style is made up of conventional, nay, vulgar phrases, and terms that happen to be current, in this respect much like a small state where all the money that circulates is foreign, because it has no coinage of its own. Mere experience can, as little as reading, supply the place of thought. It stands to thinking in the same relation in which eating stands to digestion and assimilation. When experience boasts that to its discoveries alone is due the advancement of the human race, it is as though the mouth were to claim the whole credit of maintaining the body in health. The works of all truly capable minds are distinguished by a character of decision and definiteness, which means that they are clear and free from obscurity. A truly capable mind always knows definitely and clearly what it is that it wants to express, whether its medium is prose, verse, or music. Other minds are not decisive and not definite, and by this they may be known for what they are. The characteristic sign of a mind of the highest order is that it always judges at first hand. Everything it advances is the result of thinking for itself, and this is everywhere evident by the way in which it gives its thoughts utterance. Such a mind is like a prince. In the realm of intellect, its authority is imperial, whereas the authority of minds of a lower grade is delegated only, as may be seen in their style, which has no independent stamp of its own. Everyone who really thinks for himself is so far like a monarch. His position is undelegated and supreme. His judgments, like royal decrees, spring from his own sovereign power and proceed directly from himself. He acknowledges authority as little as a monarch admits a command. He subscribes to nothing but what he has himself authorized. The multitude of common minds, laboring under all sorts of current opinions, authorities, prejudices, is like the people, which silently obeys the law and accepts orders from above. So the book philosopher has everything secondhand. His mind is a copy of a copy. Think of a photocopy that you've run through multiple generations of copying. It's distorted, you've lost quality with each succeeding generation. And there's no really way of getting it back. The fuzzy copy that you have is the best you're ever going to get. Or, another great metaphor, it's like a small nation which tends to rely upon another nation's currency to circulate within it because it can't sustain or defend its own. There's something uniquely humiliating, perhaps, in Schopenhauer's Place and Time especially, about being unable to really get your people to use your own national currency. Instead, they trade in the currency of your much larger neighboring partner. So something like that's supposed to sting a little bit, right? A person who is a book philosopher is, trading, but he's trading with, dollars or marks or euros from some neighboring state. He does take a shot here at the role of experience, and especially at the empiricists. And he says to say that experience is the source of all knowledge and the most important thing is like the mouth claiming credit for the health of the body. And we would say, yes, there's a role for it, but it's the role is kind of as an entry point for the kind of thought that will be going later on. There will be the real genuine sustaining thought that will happen after we've had the experience, when we've begun to reflect upon the lessons of it. I think here Schopenhauer, we should remember, is telling us of the need for metaphysics, which is going to be a product of thought. We're not going to be sort of bare empiricists here. We're going to need to actually appropriate for ourselves at a higher level of abstraction the lessons that we draw out of experience. So Schopenhauer is still in the tradition of German idealism. The best minds, he says, have these qualities of decision and definiteness. The man of genius knows what he wants to say. And that's interesting, because we might think, how can anybody not know what he wants to say? You might listen to a politician sometimes sort of blather on, and you realize he's sort of, the wheels are spinning as fast as the mouth is moving. He's trying to think of what to say. That's the opposite quality of the best sort of thinking mind. It's a person who's able to think before he speaks. We've heard, I think, something like that before in regards to writing. But there's a certain quality of ownership of thought, that what comes out of his mouth is just what he wants to come out, rather than sort of blathering on, discovering, trading in cliches and the like. There's here also the comparison to the monarch or the prince. There's a sort of way in which the thinking mind sits on a throne and acts and speaks with confidence out of its own authority, rather than the delegated authority that's gotten from someone else, right? So the messenger of the king who has to present the royal seal. Here is the artifact which entitles me to speak on behalf of His Majesty. So now you may pay attention to me because of this higher authority that I represent. Or like the proles, like the common people who obey silently what's given to them. Again, we see here perhaps the roots of an idea that we see developed in a different way in Nietzsche, the idea of slave morality, of people who receive what is given to them, or maybe this is the progenitors of slave morality, perhaps, not slave morality itself. What we're going to see in the next section are various practical issues and observations regarding people who rely upon authorities and attempt to sort of beat us into submission with their claims of expertise and authority. Here's what Schopenhauer writes. Those who are so zealous and eager to settle debated questions by citing authorities are really glad when they are able to put the understanding and the insight of others into the field in place of their own, which are wanting. Their number is legion. For, as Seneca says, there is no man but prefers belief to the exercise of judgment. Un usquisque mavult credere quam judicare. In their controversies, such people make a promiscuous use of the weapon of authority, and strike out at one another with it. If anyone chances to become involved in such a contest, he will do well not to try reason and argument as a mode of defense. For against a weapon of that kind, these people are like Siegfrieds, with a skin of horn, and dipped in the flood of incapacity for thinking and judging. They will meet his attack by bringing up their authorities as a way of abashing him, argumentum ad verecundium, and then cry out that they have won the battle. In the real world, be it never so fair, favorable, and pleasant, we always live subject to the law of gravity, which we have to be constantly overcoming. But in the world of intellect, we are disembodied spirits held in bondage to no such law, and free from penury and distress. Thus it is that there exists no happiness on earth like that which, at the auspicious moment, a fine and fruitful mind finds in itself. The presence of a thought is like the presence of a woman we love. We fancy we shall never forget the thought, nor become indifferent to the dear one. But out of sight, out of mind. The finest thought runs the risk of being irrevocably forgotten if we do not write it down, and the darling of being deserted if we do not marry her. There are plenty of thoughts which are valuable to the man who thinks them, but only few of them which have enough strength to produce repercussive or reflect action. I mean, to win the reader's sympathy after they have been put on paper. But still, it must not be forgotten that a true value attaches only to what a man has thought in the first instance for his own case. Thinkers may be classed according as they think chiefly for their own case or for that of others. The former are the genuine independent thinkers. They really think and are really independent. They are the true philosophers. They alone are in earnest. The pleasure and the happiness of their existence consists in thinking. The others are the sophists. They want to seem that which they are not, and seek their happiness in what they hope to get from the world. They are in earnest about nothing else. To which of these two classes a man belongs may be seen by his whole style and manner. Lichtenberg is an example of the former class. Herder, there can be no doubt, belongs to the second. When one considers how vast and how close to us is the problem of existence, this equivocal, tortured, fleeting, dreamlike existence of ours, so vast and so close that a man no sooner discovers it than it overshadows and obscures all other problems and aims. And when one sees how all men, with few and rare exceptions, have no clear consciousness of the problem, nay, seem to be quite unaware of its presence, but busy themselves with everything rather than with this, and live on, taking no thought but for the passing day, and the hardly longer span of their own personal future, either expressly discarding the problem, or else over-ready to come to terms with it by adopting some system of popular metaphysics and letting it satisfy them. When I say one takes all this to heart, one may come to the opinion that man may be said to be a thinking being only in a very remote sense, and henceforth feel no special surprise at any trait of human thoughtlessness or folly, but know rather that the normal man's intellectual range of vision does indeed extend beyond that of the brute, whose whole existence is, as it were, a continual present, with no consciousness of the past or the future, but not such an immeasurable distance as is generally supposed. This is in fact corroborated by the way in which most men converse, where their thoughts are found to be chopped up fine like chaff, so that for them to spin out a discourse of any length is impossible. If this world were peopled by really thinking beings, it could not be that noise of every kind would be allowed such generous limits, as is the case with the most horrible and at the same time aimless form of it. Translator's note. Schopenhauer refers to the cracking of whips. See the essay On Noise in Studies in Pessimism. If nature had meant man to think, she would not have given him ears, or at any rate, she would have furnished them with airtight flaps, such as are the enviable possession of the bat. But in truth, man is a poor animal like the rest, and his powers are meant only to maintain him in the struggle for existence. So he must need keep his ears always open, to announce of themselves, by night as by day, the approach of the pursuer. Schopenhauer tells us that when dealing with these citers of authority, don't bother to argue, it's wasted on them. They're not going to be moved by it. He has an interesting paragraph here about the supreme happiness of the thinking, self-knowing mind. He suggests this is the best kind of experience possible for human beings, and it's found within, and it's also intellectual. It's this kind of discovery of thought. We've got something here very close to Schopenhauer's ideal for this lifetime. He has a comparison also to the presence of a thought, like activating the longing for a woman we love. And in order to keep her near us, we marry her. In order to keep our thought, we must write it down to preserve it. We have a contrast here between the philosopher and the sophist as well. The word that Saunders translates as genuine independent thinkers in German is Selbstdenker, that is, thinkers for themselves, but those are the people who do the act which is the title of this essay, right? People who think for themselves. That title I should That title came from both from Schopenhauer and from not just from Saunders. The contrast here between the Selbstdenker is the ones who think for others. These are people who want to be admired by others. They think, we might say, for the sake of others, in order to inspire to attract the attention of others. And the way you can recognize, we might say, a true thinker for himself is that he doesn't really care about attracting the attention of others, or if he values it in an appropriate way, which is a far less important thing than simply thinking and speaking for himself. Schopenhauer here at the very end gets kind of metaphysical, I think. He begins talking about the problem of existence, the problem of coming to terms with this life and the suffering of this life. And he notes that most men will ignore this question entirely, right? Or they'll sort of cop out into easy dogmatic solutions and think selfishly only of their own lifetime and their own horizon. They won't be able to rise up to the higher level of abstraction to take in the whole question of being. Okay? I'm thinking kind of Heideggerian thoughts when I see the roots of this in Schopenhauer here. Schopenhauer's conclusion, well, we can say that man is a thinking being, but only in a very remote and general sense. Sort of the human race in general is capable of thinking, but only the very rare, excellent person, maybe even given certain, maybe even requiring certain kinds of circumstances and resources, is genuinely able to think. We might think here as well of his comment, I think it's in Studies in Pessimism, of the different types of human being, from the sort of most bestial kind of dock worker, he says in Naples, all the way up through the merchant to other classes of human being, up to the highest kind, which is the philosopher, he thinks, the one who's able to engage in this genuine metaphysical project of thinking through the problem of existence at the highest level. The conversation of ordinary people, he says, is shallow because their thoughts are like chaff, and I thought this is a really great metaphor. Chaff, very finely chopped up stuff, right? Or confetti, we might say in our time, or very short threads that can't be combined into anything else. And so their conversation has no enduring quality. There aren't the resources there in them to actually follow a long chain of argument or to think a long thought. I was very pleased here to see at the end of this essay also a reference in the footnote to Schopenhauer's hated whip cracks. See the essay on noise for his very lengthy thoughts about that. And the concluding bit of the essay, that it may turn out, thinking kind of in almost an evolutionary sense, nature just didn't design humans to think. Right? We're not really meant for that by our natural being, which is a thought that we thinkers, put ourselves and Schopenhauer in that same category, we thinkers should recognize we are rare among the human race, because nature, to keep us alive, doesn't need us to think. It doesn't need us to think very much. So doing the kind of work, the kind of philosophical work that Schopenhauer thinks needs to be done and should be done, is going to be the privilege of the relatively few. And it's going to involve sort of cutting against the main course of human life, which is devoted more to this kind of natural survival. So those are my comments on this essay. The next essay in the volume is called On Some Forms of Literature, and I'll share it with you in the next video. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye.